Good evening, everyone. Is this on? No. That's good. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, benvenuti, buonasera, una bellissima serata, and welcome to the American Academy in Rome. I'm Elizabeth Rodini, the Academy's director, and together with my colleagues, I am very happy to welcome you to the Villa Aurelia and to this evening's event, which promises to be both very important and immensely interesting. It's an honor to host it and a privilege to have all of you here with us. Tonight we focus on the most recent work of the eminent historian of modern Italy, David Kertzer, namely his soon-to-be-released book, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler, based on material that had, until just a few years ago, been sealed away in the Vatican archives. This work promises to redefine no less than how we understand the Second World War. Professor Kertzer is here tonight and will speak about his work alongside an expert set of panelists. But before introducing them, I want to pass the microphone to my colleague, Sebastian Hirl, the Academy's Drew Hines librarian, who will tell you more about our library and the library supporters who have made tonight's event possible. Sebastian.
Good evening. So I'm Sebastian Hirl, the Drew Hines librarian, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to an annual Patricia H. Labalme Friends of the Library lecture, featuring the Paul Dupee University Professor of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University, and Pulitzer Prize winning scholar David Kertzer. Before Elizabeth introduces David and our speakers, it is my privilege to introduce and thank our Friends of the Library for their support. The Friends of the Library was founded in 1961 by Professor Lily Ross Taylor, Josephine Kimball, and Mary T. Williams. For over 60 years, the Friends of the Library have provided the essential financial support to make our Arthur and Janet C. Ross Library one of the premier scholarly libraries in Rome. Through their annual dues and their direct support of library acquisitions, and through championing the library's mission, the Friends of the Library continue to strengthen our collections and services, and thus to strengthen the Academy as a whole. You have heard me say this many times, but it bears repeating. A great Academy requires a great library. And the Arthur and Janet C. Ross Library, with its 170,000 physical volumes, distributed over 4 miles of mostly open stacks, is home to 9,000 readers every year, many of whom have been coming to our library for decades and who depend upon us for access to the latest international scholarship. With numerous local libraries in Rome and beyond having dramatically reduced the acquisitions of foreign publications, the library, by providing free access to our resources and services, is making a very significant contribution to the Roman scholarly landscape. In addition to our Friends of the Library, I take this opportunity to thank our trustees, and in particular our trustees serving on the Library Committee, as well as our many long-term supporters who have made the Academy and our library the centers of creativity that they are today. My sincere thanks go to Janet and the late Arthur Ross for their essential support. To the late Barbara Goldsmith and Michael Graves, who have made it possible for us to provide a proper home to our rare and fragile materials in our Barbara Goldsmith Rare Book Room. To the late Patricia H. Labalme, noted Venetian scholar, of the Venetian Renaissance scholar, and a trustee of the Academy from 1979 to 1999, and whom we are celebrating tonight. To Vincent Buonanno and Michael Putnam, to the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, which has so generously funded our preservation and digitization projects at the Photographic Archive, and to our generous and dedicated Friends of the Library, who are too many to name here, that I would like to recognize tonight: Eli Nage, Kathy Gefgen, Liz Bartman, Bill McKern, Diane Favreau, and Fikret Yegül, and so many more. I conclude by asking all of you who work and care about the library to consider joining the Friends of the Library. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you again to the Friends of the Library. I also want to give a special thanks to our Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities, Marla Stone, for envisioning and organizing tonight's panel. Marla is also a panelist, so I'll say more about her in a moment. But I begin, of course, with Professor Kertzer. Again, a very abbreviated introduction. David Kertzer is widely recognized as one of the world's leading scholars of modern Italian history and of the recent history of the Vatican. A resident of the American Academy in Rome in 2000, he is currently the Paul Dupee Jr. University Professor of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University, where he served as provost from 2006 to 2011. He is the author of now 13 books, including in 2014, The Pope and Mussolini, winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for biography. David, I could say much more, but I will stop here. Please accept my sincere thanks to you for your presence at the Academy and your contributions to it, and especially for this very important work. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is Rea S. Hederman Critic in Residence at the American Academy for 2022. A historian and cultural critic, she is an expert on fascism and authoritarian leaders, and a frequent commentator on MSNBC and CNN. Ben-Ghiat is professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. Her latest book, Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present, examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power. Marla Stone, currently Mellon Humanities professor here at the Academy, specializes in questions of dictatorship and genocide in the modern era. Professor of history at Occidental College, she has published on topics including Italian fascist cultural politics, anti-communism, the contemporary far right in Europe, and Italian Holocaust memory culture. Her current book in progress is entitled The Enemy, The Politics and Propaganda of Anti-Communism in Italy. Lutz Klinkhammer is Deputy Director and Head of Contemporary History at the German Historical Institute in Rome. He has taught contemporary European history at the universities of Viterbo and Bologna, as well as in Germany. His main research interests include National Socialism and the Second World War, including relationships between the modern state and the Catholic Church. And his many publications include Stragi naziste in Italia, La guerra contro I civili, 1943-44. And Simon Levis Sullam, who is Associate Professor of Modern History at Ca' Foscari and the University of Siena. Levis Sullam's areas of work include the 19th and 20th century Italian history, especially the history of politics and culture, Jewish history, and the history of anti-Semitism and of the Holocaust. Among his many publications, I highlight only one from 2018, The Italian Executioners, The Genocide of the Jews of Italy. My sincere thanks to all of you, and let's begin. Professor Kertzer.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the American Academy for organizing this event, and to Marla Stone and others, Tina Cancemi, who put this all together. It's a special treat because, and maybe this is a bit strange that we're having this event around my book, but the book actually hasn't been published yet. It's coming out in Italy with Garzanti on May 26th, and then in the US on June 7th with Random House, so hope to pique your interest. But you'll be rushing to the bookstores, I'm sure, in 2 or 3 weeks. The Pope at War is a book about the controversial wartime Pope, Pius XII, how he dealt with the war and how he dealt with the Holocaust, the Shoah. But not just how he dealt with it, but why he did what he did, which I think is part of the mysteries that now we can begin to unravel. There are various spurs to the writing of this book. Some go far back, but the controversies over Pius XII have been raging. Probably one can date it to the 1963. There was a play, some of you may remember, Il Vicario in Italian, The Deputy in English. It was actually banned in Italy, but a major topic of conversation in the rest of Western Europe and the US where it played. And the whole controversy, public controversy around the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust maybe dated to that. And a number of years later, there was a book by John Cornwell called Hitler's Pope. It's a rather provocative title. So this has been a very bitter historical controversy that has been raging. I think there are very few that really could be compared to it for the divisions that this has caused. They're the great defenders of the Pope who see him as a heroic figure, a courageous figure who fought against fascism and against Nazism and was a great savior of Jews. But then there's the other side, the people who criticize the Pope for his silence, for seeing him actually as a coward rather than a courageous. There had been great pressure on the Vatican to open its archives for the war years because of this controversy. And they finally, Pope Francis in 2019 announced that a year hence, they would finally be opening those archives, and they did open in March of 2020. As I've recently written a book about Pius XII's predecessor and his relationship with the fascist regime, a book Elizabeth mentioned, The Pope and Mussolini was its title in English. It was kind of logical for me to look at the next chapter of this history of the relationship of the Vatican with the fascist regime and with National Socialism. So I kind of made a bet. It was a bet that the Vatican was going to open these archives, that Francis, it's part of his attempt for greater transparency in the Vatican, and given all the pressure that's been going on for decades to open the archives, that pretty soon Francis would open them. So I began working, after I finished the other book, on this history, because there were a lot of archives that were open, basically all the state archives, both in Italy, but also in France, in Germany, in Britain, and the United States. So I spent some years putting together tens of thousands of documents from those archives that were already opened, when fortunately Francis made his announcement that authorizing the opening of the Vatican archives. So there was great excitement when March 2nd, 2020, those archives were opened. I was outside the front door with some other colleagues and had rented a place for several months and was planning to be working there when, of course, with COVID, after the first week, they closed down. And then there was a lockdown in Italy. I went back to the US. Fortunately, my colleague and collaborator, Roberto Benedetti, being Roman, was able to stay, and they reopened those archives after just 3 months of closure. And so we've been able to, the result is several thousand pages of archival documents that offer new light on this controversial history that we now have available, that we now have copied. But I would say that although rightly there's been a lot of concentration, a lot of emphasis on the value of those newly opened Vatican archives, a lot of the most important documents to be able to bring this history back to life and understand it come from other archives, both the fascist archives, the various Italian archives, but also German, British, French, American archives as well. And you have to remember that each of these countries had envoys who were sending almost daily reports back from Vatican City about their daily meetings with the people around the Pope and occasionally with the Pope himself. So that what I tried to do was triangulate the documents from all these different sources around the same events to provide a kind of kaleidoscope of vision that helps reconstruct it. I won't lengthen these kind of introductory comments beyond this and get into some of the findings of the book. Wait to hear what my colleagues here, to whom I have a great debt for their willingness to participate in this, what they would like to bring up, and then I'll have a chance to respond. All I will say is that I did learn that there were people who said there wasn't much new to be learned. For one thing, in response to all the criticism about the silence of the Pope, Paul VI authorized a group of Jesuit scholars to put together 12 thick volumes of documents from World War II that were published between 1965 and 1981. So there's some people who said we're really not going to find anything new. We already pretty much know what happened. What we found is that's not true at all. There's a lot new that's to be learned. And not only, by the way, from the new Vatican archives, but even from those other archives, practically every year there are new material, including the American archives, the British archives, and so on, Italian archives, that's added that hadn't been processed before, hadn't been cataloged before. So there's much new and even some really quite kind of clamoroso findings that can now come out for the first time. And we just end these introductory comments by saying that the misrepresentation, the many myths that surround the Vatican, Pius XII, and World War II, the way I see it as someone interested in Italian history, is part of a broader pattern. It's not just the Vatican. It bears also on the difficulty Italy has in coming to terms with its role in World War II. And so perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about that as well. So with those comments, and thanking again the American Academy, I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about such an important book and to return to Rome after it's been too long. So start with a quote. "The Pope may pray for Putin, but he's clinging to neutrality on Ukraine." This is the title of a Politico EU article by Hannah Roberts, published on April 27th, 2 months into Russia's brutal war of annihilation on Ukraine. Quote, "For Francis, the dilemma is whether to use his moral standing to explicitly denounce Russia or hold back in the hope of creating space for mediation." Now, Pope Francis, a deeply human and humane presence in the world, in my opinion, has condemned the war's brutality in general. But he's been active behind the scenes in diplomatic efforts. Yet, he speaks in vague terms. He never mentions Putin by name, and his few public pronouncements on the war have sometimes played into propaganda by the Kremlin and their ally, the Russian Orthodox Church. Last week, Pope Francis told the Corriere della Sera, "In Ukraine, the conflict has been created by others than Putin, presumably," and said that NATO, by barking, quote, "abaya," at Russia's door, perhaps facilitated the invasion. Placing responsibility for the war on NATO is an official Kremlin talking point recently trotted out in Putin's May 9th Victory Day speech. Quote, "Church backers say a dogged commitment to neutrality is pragmatic," writes Roberts. And we know that Francis disapproves of the politicization of prelates. It's why he warned Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, to make sure he didn't turn into, quote, "Putin's altar boy." And yet when Foreign Minister Lavrov addressed the UN Human Rights Council a few weeks after the invasion started, the Holy See delegate was among the few who remained when 140 other diplomats walked out. And the Vatican abstained on a March Organization of Security and Cooperation vote to investigate possible war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine. Now, I'm starting with this uncomfortable parallel, not to say that Putin is another Hitler, but because it offers an example of the continuities in institutional behavior by the Vatican, regardless of who's in charge. Pope Francis and Pope Pius XII are very different people, and Pope Francis is charting new territory for the Church in so many ways. And yet this quote I'm about to read you from Professor Kertzer's book, where Pope Pius XII says, quote, "I have done my precise duty, taking care not to offend anyone, avoiding any particular references, indeed studiously taking care to say the least possible, has some resonance with Pope Francis' behavior as another dictator today wages an imperialist war that has an open aim of annihilation. Professor Kertzer's magisterial book argues convincingly that protecting the interests of the Church and not antagonizing either Mussolini or Hitler dictated the Vatican's actions, or rather non-actions, during World War II. Best to say nothing is the title of chapter 23, and it's a recurring sentiment of Pius XII in response to years of fascist and Nazi dictatorship, German plunder of Poland, the expansion of Axis Europe with war crimes committed in every new occupied territory, and the roundups and mass executions of Jews that we know as the Holocaust. Professor Kertzer's study is comprehensive and nuanced because he uses these newly available Vatican documents in conjunction with archives in Italy, Germany, France, Britain, and the US. And if you've used archives a lot, I know many of you in the room have, it's not uncommon if you do a really deep dive into a subject and you consult multiple archives. Sometimes you'll find the same document in different document collections, especially if you're doing diplomatic or international history. And what Professor Kertzer's book adds is the voice of the Vatican. And due to Pope Francis' decision to open these Pius XII archives in 2020. And the Vatican archives are a real treasure trove. I have, for my own project, I have used the pontifical work of assistance that was getting refugees and others home. And they add something that other archives just don't have. They're quite amazing. So for many people who read this book, the crux of the matter will be the Pope's access to a continuous flow of information from lay and clerical sources about the extermination of European Jews, including those from, quote, under his windows in Rome. And I'll leave it to my colleagues here to delve into that. But it's not surprising, as Kertzer notes, that the Vatican focused on helping baptize Jews and Jews married to Christians, leaving the rest to their fate. Yet, Professor Kertzer's book is broader than this. It's actually it's a history of wartime Vatican diplomacy. It's a history of an institution and a sovereign entity located inside a dictatorship. Italian history, and that's one reason I wanted to study fascism. It's just, it has these conditions that you don't find anywhere else. It's very, very interesting. And Professor Kertzer's eye for telling detail brings him to report that when the Duce was removed from power by his own Grand Council on July 25th, 1943, Romans were celebrating. He paints the picture of this celebration in the streets very well. The Pope kept his windows closed. He didn't go to any balcony or window. Professor Kertzer's book also illuminates the Pope's concern for Catholic clergy in Poland and other occupied Nazi territories. And he narrates a very revealing encounter with the foreign minister Ribbentrop, who told the Pope that Hitler wanted to, quote, maintain the existing truce, and with reference to the Reich and the Vatican. And truce is a very interesting word for Ribbentrop to use because it implies a pause in a state of war, which tells you how the Nazis were conceiving of this relationship. And of course, this was a Nazi-style truce in which the German dictatorship closed church schools, persecuted clergy, and then denied it. I don't know anything about that, said Ribbentrop, lying to Cardinal Mellon, the Vatican Secretary of State. And of course, what he did know all too well was that keeping the Vatican fearful of reprisals was the way to maintain the cooperation. I did not want this war. It has been forced upon me against my will, Hitler told Sumner Welles, the US Undersecretary of State in 1940, as Kertzer relates. We didn't want this war. We were forced to defend ourselves against NATO, Ukrainian Nazis, and other historic enemies, says Putin today, with equal mendacity. 80 years ago, Pope Pius XII stayed silent to protect the institution he governed. As Professor Kertzer concludes, if that's the measure, then, quote, there's a good case to be made that his papacy was a success. Yet Francis today seems to be aiming higher in terms of his moral aspirations and and reversing or softening many reactionary Vatican policies. And as Putin pursues his genocide in Ukraine and policies that resemble the darkest days of communism, like deporting Ukrainians to gulags in remote areas of Russia, staying the Vatican course of cautionary silence may not prove tenable. In any case, Professor Kertzer's amazing book shows the high price humanity paid and even the prestige of the church for making such accommodations. Thank you.
I'm going to go to the podium. I'm a podium fan. I want to thank my colleagues for coming today and participating in this wonderful panel, and Professor Kertzer for writing this wonderful book, and all of you for coming today and joining us. So with the Pope at War, David Kertzer has written a powerful and important book which confronts a number of pressing and controversial questions, questions that have plagued the public and historians alike since the events themselves. With access to previously unseen Vatican correspondence, Professor Kertzer gives us a clear and multi-perspectival portrait of how Pius XII and his primary advisors collaborated with the Italian fascist government during the war, worked hard to maintain a conciliatory position vis-a-vis the Nazi regime, and most powerfully failed to speak out against the aggression, the mass atrocities, and the genocide committed by the Nazis from 1939 on, from the invasion of Poland, to the bombing of London, to the systematic deportation and murder of the Jews of Europe. The Pope at War reveals the thinking and mechanics around Pius XII's decision to prioritize the purported neutrality of the Vatican and the silence that followed. Now, while historians have long debated and speculated on the causes of Pius XII's apparent indifference and inaction, the Pope at War offers a multivalenced analysis based on the new evidence of the private correspondence of the Pope himself, the Vatican Cardinal Secretary of State, Luigi Maglione, the Deputy Secretary of State, Giovanni Montini, and future Pope, and the vast documentation left by Axis and allied ambassadors to the Holy See, as well as the numerous papal nuncios. So with this material in mind, the Pope at War takes a position between the previous poles of historical interpretation, as Professor Kertzer referred to. Previously, the choices were either Pius XII was Hitler's Pope, deeply sympathetic to the Nazis, eager for a Nazi-fascist victory, obsessed with the defeat of the Soviets at all costs, and a dedicated anti-Semite. The other historiographic position held that Pius XII did everything within his power to help those suffering under Nazi and fascist oppression, and that he was merely constrained by circumstances. In this book, Pius XII's ideology and personality emerge as the driving forces behind his behavior and his decisions. Here, what is front and center is that above all, Pius XII saw the church as embattled and under threat, and that his mission was to protect it by any means necessary. He saw himself up against the barbaric forces of de-Christianization, the Soviet Union and its European communist parties and movements. And he would enlist any allies in that crusade whom he would imagined would help the church survive. He did this through a strategy of purported, as I said, neutrality and quiet accommodation, while simultaneously presenting the Vatican and himself as the representatives of peace on earth. Pius XII's reactions during the war, or lack thereof, were products, as I said, of his personality and ideology in combination. So what was Pius XII's ideology? As I said, a single-minded commitment to save a perceived embattled church, and at the center of this was Pius's overarching fear and hatred of communism. For Pius XII, communism was the de-Christianizing force that he believed he had been called by God to defeat. For Pius and the Church, the communists, the Soviet Union, were the senza Dio, the godless, the existential threat that had to be destroyed in order to save humanity. So upon Italy's declaration of war against the Soviet Union in 1941, the Catholic press, the neutral Catholic press, wrote, "The cross will once again appear atop the Kremlin's cupola." And this article continued, "Italian troops were called to do battle with the murderers of Catholic Spain, the godless, the irreducible enemies of Christian civilization." No such clear statements were ever made against the Nazis. Flowing from his obsessive anti-communism came the Vatican's reticence in the face of fascism and Nazism, as the forces fighting and hopefully obliterating communism. That said, Pius XII did have differing positions and policies versus fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. With Mussolini and the fascist regime, he found willing partners with whom he signed the Lateran Pacts of 1929, making Catholicism the state religion once again and bringing religious education back to Italian schools after decades of anti-clerical post-Risorgimento governments. Pius's accommodation with Italian fascism and Mussolini was a constant, lasting up until fascism's final days, when Pius refused, as has been mentioned, refused to celebrate the fall of Mussolini in July 1943. While Italy was fighting on the side of the Axis, Pius XII called on Italian clergy to support Italian military intervention, to preach obedience, and to rally the faithful from their pulpits to defend fascism. In his relations with the Nazi regime, Pius XII and the Curia sought a working relationship that would protect the church in Germany, even at the cost of never criticizing Hitler, and even as Polish clerics begged Pius to speak out about the destruction of the Polish church and the murder of Polish clergy. Pius continued to remain silent, both out of a desire for a new concordat in 1939 and 40, and because he imagined, again, that the Axis could offer a Christian crusade against communism. His desire not to anger Hitler led to a muzzling of the Catholic Church in Germany and a censoring of the Vatican press. To fully understand the ideology and worldview of Pius XII and the Vatican Curia during the war and the Holocaust, we do have to understand that Pius XII and those around him were very much products of the world that produced them. Anti-Semitism and the idea that the Jews were destined for punishment was a long-standing element of church belief and practice. Let us not forget, as we sit here in Rome, that the Catholic Church invented the ghetto in 1555 and invented the idea that the Jews needed to be separated from the non-Jewish population. The church invented the practice of forcing Jews to wear identifying signs on their clothing. None of this past church history was lost on the Nazis. So the continued depth of this anti-Semitism is obvious in the fact that Pius XII never spoke out against the racial laws of 1938 and painfully neither said nor did anything in the wake of the deportation of the Jews of Rome on August 16, 1943, a roundup that also has been referred to and which took place practically within the sight of the windows of the Apostolic Palace. What Pius did do in 1943, however, confirms his indifference to the plight of the Jews. The Pope and his Secretary of State intervened determinedly and repeatedly to save baptized Jews and the children of mixed marriages. So while terrified of rumors of possible Nazi aggression against the Pope and the Vatican in that heated summer of 1943, Pius did leave the Vatican twice to comfort victims of Allied bombings in San Lorenzo and the San Giovanni neighborhoods of Rome. But yet he was unable to cross the Tiber to witness or comment on the deportations to Auschwitz or to even make a statement. When fascism fell and the Bergoglio government began to revise or to discuss revising the racial laws, Pius XII only weighed in to the extent to ask for a revision that would exempt Jews married to Catholics. Professor Kertzer rightly stresses the role of Pius XII's personality in his decision-making. We get a vision of a deeply frightened and cautious man. The ambassadors to the Holy See who went in and out of his office during the war years consistently described him as extremely prudent, silent and reserved. One of them wrote that he, quote, crafted his speeches in a way that ensured that they would offend no one. Pius XII was conflict averse, afraid at all times of threats to the church, and by 1942 and 43, afraid of his own safety. Historians tend to shy away from putting personality front and center. But I think here isn't a case where it was determinative, particularly when one thinks of his predecessor, Pius XI, and the statement critical of Nazism that he was poised to make in 1939. Pius XII's timid, conflict-averse personality fueled the fantasy of Vatican neutrality, a neutrality that he believed would preserve the church, but in fact was not a real neutrality. Again, we cannot separate personality from ideology, and Pius XII's ideology was fixed and clear. He wanted to do everything to protect the church, everything else was secondary. But he was also tactical and strategic, and as it became clear that the Axis would lose, Pius XII pivoted, reached out to the Americans, and wanted to reconfigure the Vatican as a peacemaking geopolitical actor. So strategic thinking is also essential to understanding the history of the Vatican during World War II. In the end, Pius XII and the Vatican Curia around him chose caution, self-preservation, and indifference over taking a moral stand. We are left once again with that powerful admonition about the dangers of indifference in times of great moral crisis. Thank you.
So good afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and talk about the new book of Professor Kertzer, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler. And the book is brilliantly written, ça va sans dire, and it is excellently researched. You see this of the apparatus of the notes, which are more than 30% of the pages. It consists, I would say, of two books that can be read almost in parallel. The main narrative on the one hand, and the second narrative in the footnote apparatus. And the footnotes accurately document the sources used and are a seismograph of the innovative elements of the main narrative. But at the same time, they are sometimes so interesting and detailed that they can be read like little digressions on important questions. I will give you some example in a while. And it has already been said a lot about the contents, so I deal a little bit with the exterior aspects as well. This book is based on a stupendous knowledge of the research literature in English, Italian, and German, quote, only the main languages used. The research behind it is clearly addressed in the acknowledgements, and the book owes also to the collaboration of Roberto Benedetti, a modern historian who has done important archival research here on the ground in Rome. And this includes the archives of the Archivio Centrale dello Stato, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Vatican archives. And research in German and British archives has been done as well. It's a certain division of labor is helpful even in normal times, but quite indispensable in times of pandemic. But in order to speak about the contents of the book, so Pius XII is clearly the main character, but many other people act around him, statesmen and diplomats first and foremost, but also the curial apparatus and the service up to the service personnel connected to the Pacelli's German housekeeper, Sister Pascalina. And the book is divided into 40 smaller chapters, which are structured like miniatures around certain events and constellations of characters. So the narrative style predominates. Often a central event is at the center of each chapter, which Professor Kertzer approaches from the perspective of the respective dramatis personae. And this often takes the form of a direct dialogue, which he reads from the reporting, especially of the diplomats, and embeds in a reconstructed conversation, which is condensed to the core statements of the participants. So that, and the transitional parts consist of reconstructions of the larger historical context, such as the course of the Second World War for Italy and the Axis forces. And this narrative technique results in a lively, varied account that leads to increased attention to the people involved, who seem more important than the institutions to which they belong. And then the negotiators are cast in a particularly strong light, so the diplomatic representatives of Great Britain and the USA, the ambassador of the Polish government in exile, the German ambassadors von Bergen and von Weizsäcker, the latter perceived by the Vatican as the good Nazi, in quotation marks, and he was, as the Pope's nuncio in Berlin, Ossenigo, put it, among those men of government, quote, who are not fanatics for National Socialism. So this is part of a post-war German myth of which facilitated the return to Western democracies as well. A prominent role is played by the son-in-law of the Italian king, and that's a very interesting aspect. And in the book, the German Prince of Hesse, grandson of the Emperor Frederick and the grand-grandson of Queen Victoria. A prominent role is played by this prince, especially in facilitating the famous visit of Ribbentrop and the meeting with the Pope in 1940, in March 1940. Above all, however, the focus is on Pius XII's Italian environment, the fascist dictatorship, within which his young state, the Vatican city-state, founded in 1929, had to operate. Mussolini and his son-in-law, Ciano, Mussolini's mistress, Claretta Petacci, Buffarini Guidi, and Dino Alfieri, and other fascist bigwigs, they populate the book in many chapters. But above all, the curial environment is thoroughly researched and told. Maglione, Tardini, Montini, Tacchi Venturi, Bogongini Duca, and figures like Monsignore dell'Acqua, which are quite new as well. Throughout, Pius XII appears as a pope who wanted to hurt neither Germany nor Italy, who tried to come to terms with a dictatorship regime, so did not give up hope of bringing the dictatorships into a certain modus vivendi with the Curia and the Catholic religion. And whether he was hoping for victory against the Soviet Union and communism is maybe open to discussion to which extent. But clearly it's coming out that the National Socialist policy of extermination in the Second World War permanently endangered this project, especially in 1942. The Allies and the representatives of the occupied countries called on the Pope to speak out and denounce the extermination of the European Jews to the world as an injustice. And the sources presented to the Vatican are overwhelming, which are presented in a dense chapter of the book. So, or examples like the Cardinal Lonto wanted to, the Polish Cardinal wanted to speak out against the treatment of the Jews in Poland, and he was silenced. And so it's emblematic that they are presented central points and central sources, like the Christmas speech of 1942, in which Pius uttered a sentence on the unjust persecution of people because of their race. But the Allied observers considered this far too little, especially the Poles. The utterance had been wrapped up in a tediously long speech. The printed text of the speech ran over 20 pages. So then there comes out this cautiousness, and more than 50 times in the book you find the word silence in order to describe this particular behavior. And more than 100 times we can read the word fear as the main mood or emotion, which was present not only in the Vatican, but so there are a lot of important examples who describe the genesis of this silence, and there's a memo by the British envoy Osborne, who reported to London, and that the Pope wants to preserve an appearance of neutrality that will one day enable him to play a part in restoring peace. I quote, he does not see that by his silence he is hopelessly prejudicing his prospects of being listened to. And the journal of Monsignor Angelo Roncalli, which is used, who had an audience with the Pope in October 41, he asked me, quote, wrote the future Pope John the 23rd, then visiting Rome from his post as papal envoy to Turkey, quote, if his silence regarding the Nazis' actions is not a mistake. So there is the question of the mood and the emotions of the Pope in dealing with the German the German politics, and the German occupation of Rome is a very strong example for that. The not speaking out a critique on the German behavior, and as a bishop of Rome, under his very windows, the roundup of the Roman Jews was taken in action. And so any action that, and then another interesting source, which is quoted in the book, is that the Pope's decision not to take any action that might stop the deportation of Rome's Jews, or even that might publicly show his displeasure, was no doubt due in part to his eagerness not to upset the harmonious relations he had established with the occupying German military. And this is Nuncio in Italy, who was writing this. It is revealing that the dramatic roundup of Rome's Jews did not distract one of the national leaders of the university branch of Catholic Action from taking time, and I quote from the book, that day in Rome to write to Monsignor Montini to warn of a different threat he thought required the Vatican's attention, the appearance of Catholic communists, and there's a quotation by Giulio Andreotti. So we have a very thorough discussion on historiography, especially in the footnotes on the bombing, for example, the discussion of the bombing, but on dramatic moments for example, the March 40 in Rome, with the presence of Ribbentrop, with the presence of the American Secretary of State Summerwells, which was informed by Mussolini that Germany would attack France. So there are very important aspects, and the surrounding, which is extremely important to understand the behavior and the actions of the Pope and of the Vatican Curia. So thank you very much for your attention.
I would also like to thank the American Academy in Rome for this wonderful occasion, and I'm honored and pleased to be here in celebration of David Kertzer's new book, and I thank especially Professor Marla Stone for organizing this event. One of the aspects which have struck me of this book, and Lutz Klinkhammer was commenting about it, is the literary quality of it, the formal aspects and how it is readable, and the literary side of it. And a model has come to mind if we are to search among biographical models and historiographical models, which is Plutarch's Parallel Lives, a classic of Greco-Roman historiography, as you know, dating from the 2nd century of the current era, and analyzing in parallel the life of Greek and of Roman personalities, for example, Alexander the Great and Caesar, and exploring their ethical or unethical lives. In our case, in the case of David Kertzer's books, we are dealing with a decisive segment of the parallel lives of Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, and Benito Mussolini. They are seen through a tragic plot, which tells us also of the atmosphere of the book, which could be that of a Greek tragedy, with a chorus of foreign diplomats and members of the Vatican Secretariat of State, or the Italian ministers, especially Galeazzo Ciano, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, dialoguing with the protagonists and commenting upon their action. The plot is tragic because Mussolini, entering World War II, is on the verge of downfall and he will be executed at the end of the story, while Pius XII is also participating in the tragedy of the war and appears as a tragic character, especially for his inability to act. And in part, this is also true for Mussolini at the end of his 20 years in power. So we may say that partly these characters are being humanized by David Kertzer's writing, but they actually are finally historicized as human personalities and human actors, of course, at the fore of political decision and epoch-making events. Kertzer is also deeply fascinated by the setting of such parallel lives, Rome, the Vatican, their ancient palaces, and we are skillfully guided through by the author using rich descriptions of the Apostolic Palace, of Mussolini's office in Palazzo Venezia, of the Quirinale, and other major historical landmark sites in Rome. And Kertzer also shows the keen eye of the anthropologist interested in the symbols of power and its pomp and display, analyzed in public and diplomatic ceremonies, in masses and occasions of prayers, in the analysis of how the main characters dress and perform their public role and persona. At the same time, this is also a history of Italy during the war. As a historian and an anthropologist, David Kertzer is interested in analyzing in the background of this book the role of the church in Italian modern politics and identity. This theme has been central, obviously, to classic analysis from Machiavelli to Gramsci, and the function of Catholicism actually featured prominently also, though in conjunction with a different side of the political spectrum and in a much more recent period of history, in Kertzer's first book, perhaps lesser known than his later production, but quite important, Comrades and Christians, Religion and Political Struggle in Communist Italy, which appeared with Cambridge in 1980. As it is well known, David Kertzer has looked especially at the role of the Vatican and of Catholicism in his work of the last 25 years or so, since the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which appeared in 1997. But in this new book, Kertzer devotes himself to what we may not call Hitler's Pope. Kertzer openly rejects the provocative title of John Cornwell's book on Pius XII, but perhaps Mussolini's Pope, given the influence Mussolini exerted on Pacelli, as we see now from the book, and especially, as we also find out in new ways from this volume, Pius XII's attention to, care for, and support of Mussolini, whom Pacelli had come to know quite closely, at least since he became the Vatican's Secretary of State in 1930. Together with his 2014 book, The Pope and Mussolini, The Pope of War, the new book, raises the question of clerical fascism, or clericofascismo, a phrase that indicates the convergence of the Catholic world with fascism. The question raised are, would have fascism consolidated and stabilized without the support of the Church? How epoch-making and central was the state-church conciliation and the Lateran agreements of 1929? What was the contribution of Catholicism to fascist ideology and rituals? If nothing else, as a central structure of Italian society and culture for example, in terms of submission to the authority. Certainly, also during the war, although Mussolini remained in his heart an anti-clerical, Il Duce would make no move that would displease the Vatican, and the same was true for Pius XII, who declared himself an admirer of and faithful to Mussolini, clearly more than to Hitler. But the question at stake was not merely diplomatic, as we find out from this book. It was a political, cultural, and anthropological question, as that of the influence of Catholicism and the Church on Italian society and history, also in the 20th century. Now, if we come to the question of Pius XII's silences, one could think that the question of the Pope's silences in the face of the Holocaust cannot be really documented through the archives, as you cannot document directly silences or inaction. Now, David Kertzer's richly documented work shows, on the contrary, how many requests to the Pope to speak up against the Axis and to denounce the extermination of the Jews can be actually documented coming from high diplomats, organizations, and individuals during the war. It also shows very clearly how the decision not to speak was the result not only of Pacelli's will or inability to action, but also of the advice and interventions coming from distinguished and influential members of the Vatican secretariat, the Secretariat of State, from Maglione to Tardini to Angelo dell'Acqua, an especially influential and pernicious figure which this book brings to the fore as one of the experts on Jewish affairs within the Vatican, often consulted by the Pope and by his circle. The role of Montini, the future Paul VI, perhaps remains still partly undefined. Kertzer also shows that the Vatican did intervene to save lives at the personal level, for example, after the Nazi roundup of the Jews on Rome in October 1943, but it was always for Jews who had been baptized and thus had converted to Catholicism. For the majority of the persecuted Jews, there was inaction and a kind of fatalism, partly influenced by religious prejudice. When the Pope did intervene publicly, it was mostly in defense of the Vatican itself and of the city of Rome after air bombings. We also know, including from previous work by David Kertzer, that the Vatican actually approved, at least in part, the fascist racial and anti-Semitic law enforced since 1938, as can be documented from written statements, for example, by the Jesuit Father Tacchi Venturi, which were not included in the documents officially published in a historical series of documents edited by Vatican delegates in the 70s and 80s. Pius XII, Kertzer documents, always remember his German years as, quote, the happiest of his life. He declared himself an admirer of the, quote, new order, that is, the new European order created and nourished by the Axis, and which was, in a sense, the aim of the Second World War. And though not pro-Nazi, the Pope certainly feared more, as we heard, Stalin's communism, and at least in the beginning, praised the Axis crusade against the Soviet Union. The path to the formal rejection of the anti-Semitism by the Church will go well beyond the end of the war and will begin only, as is well known, with the Second Vatican Council and the Declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965. Perhaps David Kertzer will in the future give us another major contribution as a historian and anthropologist of Italy and the Church to the understanding also of the stony face and epoch-making period. If there are further directions of research we may indicate for the period David Kertzer has explored, I would indicate too as a conclusion, Pacelli's particularly close relationship, privileged relationship with Germany, since he was the Vatican envoy to Germany in the post-World War I period, and as the Secretary of State, he overlooked the conciliation between Germany and the Vatican, which happened, as you know, at the beginning of the Third Reich. Another element which sort of still remains partly unexplored also by previous historiography on Pacelli is his training, his education, his intellectual biography. We are still, in a sense, missing a full intellectual biography of Eugenio Pacelli, what he read, what was in his library, what influenced his view on fascism, Nazism, anti-Semitism, and the Jews. But clearly, any future research on Pacelli, on Pius XII, will now have to start from David Kertzer's new book. Thank you.
Thank you all.
David's going to respond.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit down and let Professor Kertzer respond. Thank you.
David Kertzer's going to respond, and then we'll turn to questions.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to our four panelists for their stimulating and incisive comments, and thanks for some of their kind words as well. In a way, there's such a scattershot of different prompts here that I'm afraid my own response will seem scattershot as well, and also want to be sure we have plenty of time for questions, but let me at least try to respond to some of the points that were raised. I think in order to understand Pius XII and his reaction to World War II, first of all, there's a question of when, which I think often isn't asked often enough. Because in the first years of the war, people thought the Axis was going to win the war, and they had good reason to think that. If you think of course, 1939, how quickly Poland was conquered, but then 1940, within practically a month, the German forces moving west drove through and occupied the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France, drove the British out of the continent. And meanwhile, then in North Africa and elsewhere, they were marching from victory to victory. There was good reason for Pius XII to fear or think that the Axis was going to win the war. If the Axis won the war, his worry was how to protect the church. And here, he never trusted Hitler. So when we say Hitler, wasn't Hitler's pope, it was interesting, Simone's comment that perhaps he was Mussolini's pope. He certainly saw Mussolini. One reason he wanted to stay on Mussolini's good side was he saw Mussolini as his most influential intercessor with Hitler. He was worried about what he saw as the anti-Christian, pagan perhaps, persecution of the church by the Nazi regime. And he contrasted this with his situation with fascist Italy, where the church was given a position of great moral authority and great power, and this whole idea of clerical fascism that was mentioned, the strong support of the Catholic clergy for the fascist regime that was so important to Mussolini. So in these first years of the war, if we think of 39, 40, 41, and even certainly the first half of 42, this was kind of the mindset that the Pope had. I've got to protect the church in a future that's going to likely come under Axis control. Then as we get to a later period, when it begins with Stalingrad and so on in late 42 and into early 43, to look perhaps more likely that the Axis was going to lose the war, one might have thought this could have changed the Pope's perhaps craven approach as far as dealing with the Axis. But it didn't, and it didn't for various reasons. One, as I think Lutz referred to, and he's the great expert on this, for 9 months of those, the German military was occupying Rome. And we now know from not only from the German archives are important on this as well, but certainly the recently opened Vatican archives, that the Pope and those around him were working overtime to stay on the good terms with the German military during the occupation of Rome. They were urging Romans not to resist. The famous Via Rasella incident, which led to the mass murder of 335 Italians, including 75 Roman Jews, 77, I think, Roman Jews, in retaliation for a partisan bombing that killed 33 German soldiers. That day, the Vatican newspaper came out, the day that the 335 were being murdered in these caves outside Rome. They came out not criticizing that, but criticizing the partisans for having killed the Germans. So when we look at why the Pope, October 16, 1943, was not going to speak out against the roundup of over 1,000 Jews to be sent to their death at Auschwitz. This is an important part of this story as well. The other thing that's happening in the later years of the war is all of a sudden the Red Army, instead of being routed, is turning the tables on the Germans and marching westward. And the fear that now an Axis defeat, an Allied victory, the Allies included Soviet Union. And so there was a real fear that the Pope had about a defeat of the Third Reich, that it would bring about an occupation by the communists, not just military, but also spurred by various privations and the spread of communist ideology among the working classes of Europe. So all this is part of this larger historical context that needs to be understood. I think one point that came up, I'm not sure this term was used, I used it once or twice perhaps in my book, there was a double game that the Pope was playing. The Pope was also not technically the primate of the Italian clergy, but unlike Poland, we had mention of Cardinal Hollande, who was the primate of the Polish clergy. There was no primate in Italy because there was a Bishop of Rome, there was the Pope. And so the Pope was responsible for the ecclesiastical hierarchy in Italy, and that hierarchy strongly supported the Axis war. This is something people don't seem to want to talk about in Italy these days, but it's very, very true, and all you have to do is read not just the Catholic press of the time, Avvenire d'Italia and so on, but the fascist press of the time, or just read what Azione Cattolica, the heads of all the different organizations of Catholic action, were sending out directives to their membership that it was important to do their patriotic duty, and this was an important war. Once in spring of 1941, the Axis war turns against the Soviet Union. As was mentioned, it becomes an actual crusade, and if you read what the bishops and cardinals in Italy are encouraging Italians to fight alongside Hitler and for the Axis cause, they were talking about in these kinds of crusade terms. Let me just say a couple of other things about the style of the book that it came up. Simone talked a bit about the narrative style, and Lutz about the copious footnotes. And I was glad he actually talked about that because I always have the fear, the book has, I don't know, 80 or 100 pages of fairly small type footnotes or endnotes. And my fear from a scholarly point of view is that very few people will read them. But there's a lot of juicy material in there, as I think Lutz pointed to. This, just talking about, in writing a book like this, and a number of all my recent books from the time I wrote The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which came out now 25 years ago, I've tried to bring 19th and 20th century Italian history to a broader public, at least outside of Italy. And to do this through doing original historical work based in archives, but written in a way that would interest a broader public in what I think is fascinating history. Here I'm not just talking about World War II, but even the Risorgimento and all sorts of aspects of 19th and 20th century Italian history. And so this is always, a challenge, and be interested whether people think in this new book I've been successful in doing this. But part of it does mean kind of demoting a lot of material to the notes to try to keep the reading, page turning and lively. But there's always this tension from the point of view of writing a book that one hopes is seen as a major scholarly contribution, but also a book that will be readable and accessible to and interesting to a broader public. Let me just conclude and open up our discussion to your questions by taking one other point that was raised, the question of the bullying of the Pope and the character of the Pope. I think we're pointing to something very important here, that both Mussolini and Hitler were experts at intimidation, and they knew how to intimidate the Pope and how to threaten him. So this, too, is an important part of the story of how Mussolini and Hitler were able to manipulate the Pope. Again, it wasn't that the Pope was pro-Hitler. He certainly wasn't, much less pro-Nazi. On the other hand, as was pointed out here, he did have the notion that there were good Nazis and bad Nazis, and there were good fascists and bad fascists. But what differentiated the good from the bad was their attitude toward the Roman Catholic Church. If they supported its prerogatives, were not threatening it, were not seen as anti-clerical, they were good, whether fascists or Nazis. But if they were opposed, were whittling away at the prerogatives of the Church, they were bad. And so in either case, the Pope was reaching out, searching for the good, whether, as Lutz mentioned, the German ambassador, or actually two ambassadors to the Holy See, who were regarded as good representatives of the Nazi regime, or in the case of Italy, people like it was mentioned, the son-in-law of Mussolini was the foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, who in his meetings with the representatives of the church, the papal nuncio of Italy and so on, constantly was talking about how often he went to his sanctuary on his private property outside of Livorno and prayed to the Madonna and so on. So this was kind of a two-way solicitation, really. So I hope some of this put a little bit in giving you a little idea of the perspective used in the Pope at War. Italian title it's interesting. Someone can explain to me. Un Papa in guerra, that is, not il Papa in guerra, but un Papa in guerra. So just a slightly different title. But thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Kertzer. That was just fascinating, the whole panel. I think the light that was shown on the book that we're all, I'm sure, very eager to read now, I'm grateful to all of you for doing that. And I think I'm completely persuaded that your storytelling is going to lead not only to take this fascinating information and weave it into a really terrific narrative. So I look forward to reading the book. We're going to take some questions now. I'm sure there are many, many. This is how it will work. You can line up at the microphone and ask a question. You can also, if you're virtually connected, you can type a question and we will get to as many of them as we can. I do have one request, and that is to really keep them to questions. And please be mindful, our speakers have all been very concise and careful with our time. So please do the same if you would. And please, go ahead.
Thank you for a very enlightening talk. I had one question for Dr. Ben-Ghiat. I found your analogy between the current situation in Ukraine and the Second World War very interesting. However, I'm not sure I totally agree with the conclusion, in that I'm not sure it actually proves a sort of pattern, in that there were several popes, I would say, between Pius and Francis that did display some sort of courage. The best example would be John Paul II in Poland. How do you think those examples play into your analogy?
I'm not an expert on papal history, so I'm not going to answer that part of it. But what these two situations have in common is they're war times, and they're situations of grave threats to humanity where genocide is being created, where there's a slaughter of life, where there's just heartbreaking brutality. And those are moments where it's interesting to see what the church does, especially somebody of the humanity of Francis. So the reason I showed this these similar, they're very different situations, and that's why I'm not trying to say one is the other. That would be silly. But it's very interesting to show how there's certain institutional behaviors that these are stewards of the church. And they need to keep all options open. They're diplomats. Also, Putin is a bully, just like I wrote a book on strong men. They have similar personalities, these people. That's how they get the power they have. And so that's, I'll leave it there, but thank you.
I just finished your previous book on the Pope and Mussolini, a previous Pope, Pius XI, who was mostly all in for Italian fascism, except with a little bit maybe toward the end. And he was a stronger personality than Pius XII, and I'm wondering if, and he made a lot of criticisms, but it really didn't make much difference except getting more stuff for the church. But otherwise, if Pius XII had spoken out, do you think anything would have changed?
Well, yes, this is a question. I think it's a very good question. And often defenders, we call them that, of Pius XII, use the argument that it wouldn't have accomplished anything, or even worse, that it would have made things worse if he had spoken out, for example, against the campaign of extermination of the Jews in Europe. I find that argument hard to imagine that, that somehow Hitler was going to have a more negative view of Jews if the Pope criticized what he was doing to them, and they would be better off. But I also think there's a difference between the Pope's influence in Germany and Italy. So I think there is a reasonable argument that if, in terms of Germany, if the Pope had taken a strong stand, that would have made a huge difference. I think Italy is a different question. How did Italy get into the war? Did Italians want to enter the war in June of 1940? They didn't enter the war initially, of course. The war is generally dated to the invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. So there are many months go by, and how did Italy come to enter the war? What could have prevented it from entering the war on Hitler's side? And that I think, is where the failure of the Pope to speak out. And in fact, the opposite, as I mentioned, is what happens, namely the Roman Catholic clergy strongly back the entry of Italy into the war, and the Pope remains silent. So this is part of what I refer to as the double game of the Pope, is the Pope was also eager at the same time to not offend especially the American Catholics, who, among other things, were where he was getting most of his financial support for the Vatican. And so he was able to say, I'm neutral and so on, but the clergy under me here in Italy is actively promoting participation in the war at the side of Hitler. So that's, I think, where I would put the emphasis on where he could have had a real impact.
Thanks for this great panel. Professor Kertzer, I'm curious, when Hitler came to Rome for his visit that was sort of filmed and so on, did the Pope have any role in that visit? Did they use him as a prop in any way? Are there any transcripts or anything about what? Did they meet? Did they talk?
Well, so Hitler comes in the spring of 1938 to Rome. So it's under the predecessor of Pius XII. So Pius, man who becomes Pius XII, is then the number 2, the Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli. But it's Pius XI who's Pope. And in fact, Pius XI was not happy about Hitler's visit, especially not happy that he was being lionized and celebrated. And in fact said something about, really got Mussolini angry, Hitler's host, namely that there was no place for the glorification of a twisted cross that was not the cross of Christ in the holy city, the eternal city of Rome. And in fact, the Pope ordered the Vatican museums closed, Pius XI, the Vatican not illuminated at night during Hitler's visit, and Hitler never did get to visit the Vatican City or the Pope.
Thank you. I think we'll take a question or two on Zoom, and then we'll be sure to get to you. Thanks for holding on.
I'm going to be reading now from Zoom. We've had one question for David. What was the most revealing aspect about the Pope that you discovered in the archives, and did it change your previous perception or expectations?
Oh, gee. It's most revealing. Well, there was a lot new that was going on that we can now know and that I report in the book. But in terms of about his character, I guess one thing this maybe allows me to comment on is sometimes it's claimed that his inaction or his silence during the Holocaust was primarily due to his anti-Semitism. And I think my reading now, although it's clear from the, among other things, the recently opened Vatican archives, that there is a great deal of anti-Semitism surrounding the Pope, and the Pope was very much in that environment. I don't think that's the aspect of his personality or background, character, if you want to call it that, that explains his silence during the Holocaust, or these other kinds of issues I mentioned of not wanting to antagonize the Nazis when he thought they were going to win the war, and then later fear of communism. So I guess maybe that's perhaps a negative finding, that although he shared in many of these negative views of Jews, that really, I don't think, explains very much of his behavior in this area.
And one more off Zoom, please.
One more from Tim Parks, who often writes about living in Italy. David, do you believe that with the release of new archive material, that we now really have all the papers and all the facts about the Pope's relations with Mussolini and Hitler, or is it possible that other material is still being held back since this has happened before?
Oh, well, okay, there are two parts of that question, I guess. And I'd recommend Tim Parks' recent book on his Garibaldi expedition to everybody. Are any papers being held back? Well, in talking with the directors of the Vatican archives, the only papers held back officially are what they refer to as private personnel records. And so if you're wondering why, for example, in all the writings about the sex abuse scandals involving the church, you haven't seen anything that's come out of the Vatican archives, it's because they're not available. They would fall in that category, for example. But in theory, all the kind of political papers are available. And I think a lot of credit should be given to the Church, to the Vatican, and to the archivists. There are really many excellent archivists, very serious archivists, who are here to facilitate research and are interested in the real history here rather than some of the myth-making. But the other part of the question about, I think the publicist from my book, at one point, or someone suggested referring to it, this is the definitive account of World War II in the Vatican. And I said, no, we couldn't use that term. I mean, there's no real such thing for a historian, I think, as a definitive account, just because there are other documents, other things that were going to come to light that'll shed further light. I don't think they'll change the contours of my narrative. I'll be surprised. But certainly there will remain many new things to learn. And I mean, the last 2 months I've been going to Vatican archives most days and finding new things all the time. I haven't changed anything that I've written in the book, I don't think, but add new elements that will be interesting to pursue.
Thank you. We'll take a few more questions, please.
I have two questions out of ignorance. The first, it strikes me that this book could have been written during the Cold War, in that all of your archival materials are from the West. So if you had, can you say something about how would it, I mean, obviously it's a hard question to ask. Basically what I want to know is, for perhaps future graduate students wanting to write a PhD, what Eastern materials, because it's extraordinary that no one noticed that all of your stuff is just from, English, British, French, Italian, German. Mm-hmm. But there must be tons of material in Eastern Europe. That's the first question. Mm-hmm. The second question is, was there a Russian embassy here there must have been a Russian embassy. Can you say something about was there no Russian embassy?
No, I mean, this is, fascist Italy.
So when did the Russian,
There were no diplomatic relations at that point.
when was the last time that there were diplomatic relations between Russia and Italy before the war?
I think it was probably before before 1917, although.
No. I think through the early 30s there was.
Were there?
Yeah.
Officially. Okay. I mean, there's, but your point is certainly a very good one about Eastern Europe. I mean,
33.
beyond there's the rest of the world too that could be brought in here, but if one looks at it from the point of view of the material available at the Vatican, the correspondence with the representatives of, for example, the Ukrainian Catholic Church and Polish, the correspondence tends to be if it's not in Italian, it's in Latin, because from the Vatican side, weren't reading these languages. There is the one in the Curia. There were about 24 members, cardinals of the Curia. 23 were Italian. One, and the only non-Italian, interestingly, Cardinal Tisserand, who's French, was in charge of the Oriental churches, the congregation of the Vatican dealing with the Oriental churches. And so it's interesting from that point of view that the Italians, and other thing I discovered is in the Vatican, it was clear there were various negative views of Slavs. So it wasn't just some negative views of Jews, but also Slavs. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that can and should be done dealing, especially with the Eastern Europe question, even getting beyond other parts of the world. It was during the war that Japan decided to appoint an ambassador to the Holy See, and this was a big, this is kind of interesting, there's huge documentation about this, not just in the Vatican, but if you read in the American and British diplomatic archives, because they're furious with the Pope for accepting a Japanese envoy in the middle of the war. So yes, I mean, you're right, there are many other important and interesting topics that there's plenty of room for other good books on this.
Yeah, I could just clarify that a little bit. There were Soviet fascist relations through the war in Spain, so through late 35, early 1936, commercial relations, also cultural relations, delegations that came, and there might have been Soviet spies here during the war reporting back.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. Okay? Thank you.
Hi. I'm wondering, was there any document that you either went into this research looking for, and when you found it, you were like, oh my God, this is it? Or did you find something? Like, was there one document that said, it was the aha moment? And then conversely, was there something that you were looking for that you didn't find or that did not pan out the way you thought it would based on your previous research in other archives? Like when you were looking at the Vatican end of things, did it not confirm what you thought it was going to?
Oh, that's both a somewhat difficult question, also exactly the kind of question that my publisher doesn't want me to answer right now. So it would, of course, come from a journalist so trying to get me in trouble. This is the problem doing this event before the book is out. I did find some documents that I regard as kind of smoking guns, and therefore were shocking. And I won't go into detail for that reason, but one involves the entrance of the Pope into negotiations with Hitler in the war that have been kept secret all these years. In terms of documents that, but more what merges is kind of pattern. For example, one of the topics I haven't commented on that was mentioned by a couple of panelists is that when the Vatican and the Pope were speaking out behind the scenes on behalf of Jews, it was actually almost always baptized Jews, and therefore from the point of view of the Church Catholics, not Jews, even though today when you have various books and other pieces, kind of papal apologetics coming out about how the Pope saved thousands of Jews, and was working behind the scenes, a lot of this had to do with baptized Jews. And that was certainly the case October 16th, 1943, when the Jews were rounded up here, over 1,000. 1,260, more or less, were seized on October 16th, but they were held for 2 days right near the Vatican at the Collegio Militare, and they were being processed. They were being processed to see who were, in fact, not to be regarded as Jews, who were baptized, and who were married to Catholics. And the fact is that the Germans didn't want to offend the Pope. And so even though it's become a truism of World War II history and Holocaust history that the Germans made no distinction based on religion, it was all race, it's just not true in Italy. And that's, I think that's a pretty striking finding from this work. So I just point to that. In terms of documents I wish I found that I didn't, I don't know, in general, I'd say I was quite satisfied with that. Now we really have, I think, a very good picture of what was going on. So I don't feel there's any big hole. I'm sure there's certain specifics one could mention, but in terms of larger issues, I think, to me, it all seems reasonably clear.
Well, I think your publicist should be proud of that teaser. Pleased with that teaser. I think we got a good one.
Yeah.
Please, last question. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists. It's super cool to meet you. I've been using your books in my classroom for many years, and I have noticed that in different types of classrooms, I get really different reactions to your work. So when I assign the Pope who would be king or prisoner of the Vatican in a classroom of Catholic students, they're often really scandalized, disturbed, and they have a huge emotional reaction, right? But when I assign it in a secular classroom, or rather a school without religious roots or identity, the students are really fascinated and they get very hungry for more information and they want to go deeper. So I wanted to know if you could comment or characterize on different types of reactions you get from different communities or audiences that fall into different groups. I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and thanks for using the books in your classrooms. Yes, I do get very different reactions. I sometimes get almost confessional reactions. People come up to me after a talk on some of these topics, not obviously on this book, which isn't out yet, but I've done work, for example, on the role of the Vatican in the rise of modern anti-Semitism. And people will say, I grew up in a Catholic, devout Catholic family. I went to Catholic schools. I didn't learn about this stuff, but I really appreciate it hearing now, even though it's painful. I think the main negative, I think people just don't come to hear, in terms of my reaction. I get a certain amount of hate mail, but in terms of where I speak, it's a bit of a self-selection, so I don't tend to get a lot of hostile reactions. But on the other hand, I'm conscious that I haven't gotten a lot of invitations over the years from church organizations. I've spoken to a lot of Catholic universities, but if I think of all the Jewish organizations and synagogues and so on that have invited me over the years, and I essentially could say I think there's 0 church organizations that have ever invited me to speak. So, that's kind of disappointing because, and it's not just Francis who's called for the church confronting its history, good and the bad, but even John Paul II was a very different kind of pope, but around the celebration of the second millennium, specifically called for the church to come to terms with its past and where it acted in ways that today it regrets, to express those regrets. And this hasn't happened in the case of the Vatican and World War II, or Vatican and fascism. And it has happened to a considerable extent, most recently with the Catholic episcopate in Germany, apologizing for the support given by the Catholic Church in Germany for the Holocaust, for the Nazi war. It's happened in France with the Catholic clergy coming to terms, but not in Italy and not the Vatican. The official statement of the Vatican on this still is the 1998 Noi Ricordiamo, we remember, which denies that there's any relationship between the anti-Semitism that could have led to the Holocaust and the what they call anti-Judaism that had characterized sons and daughters of the church for many years. But they must know that how did Italy get Italians, how the fascist government get Italians to support the racial laws? These came as a surprise to many people in 1938. They did it in no small measure by citing the past pope's use of similar measures again to keep Jews from interacting with Christians and keeping them from positions of influence in Catholic Italy. So maybe this is a roundabout way to answer that question, but these are all kinds of reactions that I see.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for the attention, the excellent questions. I want to thank our panelists and Marla again for the organization, and especially Professor David Kertzer for his excellent work. And we have the chance now, overlooking Rome, and we have so much more to think about this city and what has happened here, to talk more over a reception. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Terrific. I thought it was really good. Thank you, Lutz. I'm sorry if I cut you short. No, it's okay. It was great. It was perfect. No, we got great questions.
Great questions. And he is so good at responding that he
$1
sets
million
them on for
questions from the $1 million question from Zoom, no?
Right. What's next?
Yeah.